Did you know that nearly 40% of all physicians have a side gig? Should you have one too? Keep listening to find out. Welcome to the Money Meets Medicine podcast, where we talk all about the personal finance topics you wish you had learned in medical school. I'm your host, Dr. Jimmy Turner, and here's your co-host, who hails from the Steel City, but now lives in the rainy Pacific Northwest, Justin Harvey.
Dr. Turner, pleasure to be here as always. I can tell you, we were chatting beforehand, I do hail from the Steel City, and proudly so, and I was reflecting, I have this commemorative Super Bowl 13 mug here on my desk to remind me of the roots. And
yeah,
it's funny,
I'm a Panthers fan, so
okay.
It's not going well.
I think it was 2010 when we played or 2009 we played the Seahawks, the Seattle Seahawks in the Super Bowl, and they have not forgotten. Apparently there was some dicey call at the end or something, but I'm like, yeah, I don't know what to tell you guys. City of Champions is what it is.
Yeah, my sister actually lives in Seattle, and so she's a big Hawks fan. And but yeah, it's been a rough year as a Panthers fan. We are just legitimately terrible. So I think.
Well, the Steelers, there's no one that we cannot lose to right now. Like literally we apparently set a record, and maybe you get annoyed with this the same way I do. That there's I think it's Amazon Web Services creates all of these totally useless arcane statistics in ways that we never had to deal with in the past. But I saw the Steelers had the best record of any team that lost to consecutive teams in consecutive weeks this late in the season that only had 2 wins. I'm like, what the heck does that even mean? I have no idea, other than we had 2 really bad weeks and lost to terrible teams. But thank you, Jeff Bezos, for that little bit of data.
Yeah, that's actually hilarious. And the data that they come up with is quite impressive. And we actually have some data on this show that I'm actually really interested to dive into. So there's this Medscape survey that talked about physician side gigs, way more useful than Bezos's data. But before we dive into side gigs, I do want to just kind of shout out, many of you know that my story with disability insurance, with me getting denied by an insurance agent who didn't do the right thing for me. And so honestly, I kind of view this as a never event. It's like a sentinel event in medicine inside of a hospital. There should be a root cause analysis to figure out what happened. And, the truth is that disability insurance, in my opinion, is the number one financial task for doctors because, Justin, you and I can teach everything people want to know about investing or paying off debt. But if you don't have an income, it turns out that kind of doesn't matter. So this is why you need to get own occupation disability insurance from one of the 5 companies who sell it directly. And you can now get that through Money Meets Medicine. So some insurance companies in this space, in terms of promoting own occupation disability insurance for physicians, have a denial rate as high as 10 or 20%. And our goal at Money Meets Medicine is to have basically a 0% rate caused by any insurance agent that we work with. And so if you're looking to protect the most important asset you have, head on to moneymeetsmedicine.com, where you can get a disability insurance quote created by a doctor for doctors. So Justin, we're talking about side gigs, my man.
Yes.
I found this really interesting because I offline before we recorded, I was like, hey, Justin, your clients that you serve as physicians for, as a financial planner, how many of them have a side gig? You had a really interesting take on this. So before we dive into this Medscape survey, what's your experience with side gigs in terms of clients or doctors that you know?
Yeah, it's funny, since that conversation just 5 minutes ago, I was trying to close the gap in my mind of why is this, of the reported amount of physicians who have side gigs and what I see on people's tax returns with some sort of ancillary situation happening. There's a delta there that is meaningful, meaning I think a lot more people say they have side gigs than actually make any money doing anything other than clinical medicine. My reflection on that is fine. You can make a lot of money doing clinical medicine, and it's tough to make $100 or $200 or $300 or $500 an hour doing something else that's not clinical medicine, and it takes a long time to get there in many cases. So I think it's pretty unreasonable to not, run an Etsy store or try to create a Facebook group that you can monetize, or those are a slow build. And yes, you can turn that into money over time, but there's a front end investment, and you could call that a side gig. And maybe some of my clients that I don't even know about, they're doing that stuff and they're just not making any money with it yet. And totally possible.
Yeah. Just not showing up on their tax return. Obviously people listening to this know a little bit about my story, starting out as a blogger in November of 2017. So I basically took $5,000 from another side gig doing medical malpractice work put it into a business bank account and said, I'm never putting another dollar into this thing. And, and it became pretty successful, right? So at its peak, I mean, it was making over $500,000 a year, which was something I was pretty happy with. I make nowhere near that at this point because I have very different goals. But at the same time, blogging, podcasting, writing books, you're right. Like my big pet peeve in this space isn't the side gig conversation. It's actually when people are like, oh, passive income. The only passive income that I have at this point is from being an author. I'll tell you that writing books, by and large, does not make money. But if you want to, put a shilling out there for the pauper over here and go buy my books, fantastic. But you're not going to make a lot of money from it. But there's like a huge investment on the front end to write the book and the thousands of hours or whatever that go into doing that. And so there isn't really a truly passive thing that I found in the space. I mean, even if you're vetting syndications or real estate deals, like the work up front is still there. And so there's this pipe dream, I think, in this space of like, oh, I'm just going to sleep for dollars. It's like, you can, but oftentimes there's a lot of work up front. And for the online entrepreneurs and the budding entrepreneurs who see bloggers and podcasters and YouTubers, the failure rate is massive. It's like 80 or 90% of those people fail. And so when I'm coaching people, you kind of had a distinction there, Justin, that you're drawing in terms of like making it on a tax return. I always tell people, be very clear about your why, right? If it's a hobby and you're just doing it for fun or because you want to help other people, by all means, have a hobby, have some purpose. I think that's great. If you're going to make money from it, very intentionally, you should build it as a business. But the worst thing don't want to happen is for it not to be a job, not to be a hobby, and you make what I call a jobby. Like it's not the place to be. And so that's actually an experience that they're like, oh, I'm just going to try it out and build this Facebook group or do this blog. And, if it makes money, great. And if it doesn't, it just ends up being a pain and people quit. Lots of people quit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually you made a great point. I want to circle back to this medical legal work, depositions, expert witnessing. That is I think this is like the lowest hanging fruit in terms of side gigs. You're still using your medical degree, and that's why it's valuable. Like, there's not a lot of people that can do that. Same way that there's not a lot of people that can do clinical medicine. There's not a lot of people that can get on the stand, be cross-examined by a lawyer, and stand there on their own 2 feet and speak for themselves from their experience and their training, what they have witnessed and what standard of care and did what happened, transgress the line of standard of care. You can make good money doing that. And I do have a few clients that do that, actually, and it's a 5-figure number in many cases. I think if somebody's out there thinking like, oh, all right, you've told me that it's hard to find anything and I shouldn't write a book and I shouldn't start a blog, like look into medico legal as a way to non-clinically use your training, use your hard work, your expertise to still get that, because you either need to be building something that is inherently valuable, a business, or you need to be getting high dollars per hour to make it worth your time. The reason you would be willing to work for free to write a blog for 5 years is because you hope that eventually it turns into a business that has inherent enterprise value.
Right.
But if you're not going to be able to cash it out on the back end, then you need high dollar per hour on the front end for it to make any kind of sense.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And for me, really the payoff, the focus was the entire time that I wanted to be able to go part-time. And I'm one of those crazy people that, and I actually want to do an episode on this at some point, Justin. So we'll just track this down on the Google spreadsheet there, and maybe we'll talk about Coast Fire. But I personally, like, my kids are young. I've got a 12, a 10, and a 7-year-old at the moment, and I am 38 years old, right? So I had kids when we were young, and I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss this. And so I'm probably going to do a little bit of backwards medicine where, like, I'm part-time right now. I still very much enjoy anesthesia. And I could totally see myself 11 years from now when my youngest is out of the house, going back and practicing closer to full-time, if not completely full-time, and doing it the other way around because I don't want to miss my kids growing up. But the way that I was able to purchase that in the early days when I still needed a higher savings rate so that I could coast fire, that basically required me to create income outside of my clinical job, because otherwise I was just going to be at the hospital. And I didn't want to miss T-ball games and recitals and, the whole 9 yards. We went to my daughter's Taekwondo thing last night where she got an increase in her belt and got to snap the board and like do her whole like 20-step routine thing. And so that's important to me. And I knew that making money outside of medicine would allow me to make money, supplement that income that I'd be losing, and allow me to be home a little more often. But there was 2 years at the beginning where I made $0. So I was working 50 hours a week at the hospital, another 20 hours a week on a blog, and it made nothing. So all to your points, up front, if you want to make money quickly, probably not the way to go. If you want to own a business on the back end that has potential, but could also fail 80 to 90% of the time, maybe that's an option, right?
I love the Coast Fire idea. I've actually done a podcast episode on this. I talk to clients about this a lot too, like especially the hard charging, I'm in my 30s, and especially like I just became an attending. I got to prove myself. I'm in the private group, or I'm being asked to take on these leadership roles. I know you haven't experienced anything like this. This is probably a totally foreign concept.
None.
And there's this, you're early enough in your career that you feel that obligation. You're not sure, like, when is it okay to like take the wheel and like be my own boss and do my own thing. Even as an employee, you can communicate in a way that gives you more autonomy. But
sure,
there is that pressure, and it is unmitigating. Like you need to eventually push back, hit back, realize that until you do that, you're going to just keep getting piled on. And the Coast Fire mechanism, saying like I can, from the ages of 35 to 47, make enough money where I don't need to save 35%. Maybe I'm only saving 7%. And I'm maxing out my 401k and not doing anything else and working 0.7 so that I can go to the t-ball game, so that I can go to I can't wait until my kids are old enough for martial arts because I can't, I want to do the gi and get the boards and all that with them. I think that's going to be sweet. I think in terms of how do you build the best life possible for physicians who are privileged to have a vocation that remunerates very well on a per hour basis, you can do that. This is within your grasp if you intentionally construct your life in that way.
Yeah, we had Nee and Renee Darko on in a prior episode, and they're obviously huge on locums and have built their entire life around locums work, and it has allowed them to very much have that balance. But like, I'm recording, for those of you watching on the YouTube channel, I'm recording in a different location today than I often do, and the reason why is because my kid's sick, right? So I had to go buzz over to school, pick my kid up. He's upstairs. Don't worry, I'm gonna check on him in between episodes. He's doing okay. He's got his apple juice and his crackers. But while he's sick upstairs, I'm able to work from home because this is something that I've kind of helped create. But yeah, I totally. When I first started, I was saving, probably 30% of my income. It was close to $100,000 a year, and now if I looked at the numbers, it's closer to about 60. And so I built that nest egg early. That's going to continue to compound. When they were young, and they honestly wouldn't as much miss me not being home. And now that they're older, like I'm 0.7 FTE working a couple of days a week, plus some call during the year. And yeah, it's really worked out for me. But I'm not the exception here. It's kind of interesting because this study, this Medscape, survey, thousands of docs, 50% of docs, 48 to be exact, aged 40 to 49 have a side gig. And even if you were older than 70, 30% of them still had a side gig. And so I found that really interesting because, there are these Facebook groups out there that have 100,000 doctors in them just about side gigs, about 600,000 doctors that are practicing, full-time medicine or medicine in some capacity in the country. There's 1 million overall. These numbers were really interesting because it really does show an interest, and everybody outside of medicine finds these numbers crazy because they're like, why would a doctor who makes that much money decide to have something outside of medicine? And for me, at least the perspective, the lens with which I view this is that there's obviously kind of a burnout epidemic in medicine, and there's a desire to make money outside of medicine so you don't have to be at the hospital or clinic as often as you might be required working full time. I don't know if that's been your experience too, Justin.
Yeah, this is where it gets really sobering really fast. And I have my sort of micro perspectives of how do I help this doctor, this family, this household optimize their life as best I can using all the resources and all the tools in the toolbox. That's the micro question that I solve on the daily basis. But when I get to the 30,000 foot view and we see all these doctors and all these, every type of clinician, it's not just physicians. People are just dying to get out of medicine in many cases. And even my clients who are like the 38-year-old, like they're finally making money after grinding and slaving, and they got a couple graduate degrees in many cases. And they're like, how do I get out of this in 4 years? And at the macro level, this is so, it's
bad.
It's bad. It's
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
The early days of the physician philosopher, the tagline on the site was fighting burnout with financial independence. So like these two ideas have always been linked to me. Ended up writing a second book on burnout, and a huge piece of that as I was doing the research and the study to write that book was on, autonomy and the importance of autonomy, both from a professional standpoint, being able to practice medicine how you want to, but also from a personal standpoint, those T-ball games and recitals that I was alluding to before. And personal finance fits squarely into that peg of trying to fix that problem that doctors feel like they don't have, right? That they don't have autonomy. And so this survey, when they asked them like, hey, okay, you have a side gig, why? Over 50% said is to make more money, right? So financial freedom is clearly the driver here, and they're trying to create some autonomy through these endeavors. And only 10% of them did it because they said it was fun, right? So I think this does really speak to that larger macro perspective that you're alluding to.
Yeah. And I would be curious if we talked to these doctors and said, what are you doing? What is your side gig? How much are you making doing it? I think
they looked into that, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear more about how you process that information. But that's where I like something like medical legal and something like locums. If you call that a side gig, that's where you can accelerate your journey by using your credentials and experience to make good money.
Yeah, and I think this is actually a limiting thought that makes that number 48% that doctors that work in a side gig and not 75% is a lot of doctors like, oh, I don't have a translatable skill set. That is not true. It's just not true, right? You got to learn communication. You have to learn leadership. You have to learn, the ability to problem solve. Like there are a lot of things in addition to your medical expertise that doctors have that they can use. But they broke it down into two different things. One was the medical field. Like, do you have an extra side gig that's related to your medical degree? And the other one is, do you have one that's not? The most popular ones that were related to your medical degree are medical consulting, which I find really interesting. After, spending 11 months in the venture capital space, there's definitely a need for companies that want consultants or advisors to help them figure out, okay, what do doctors want? Or what do I need to provide in this healthcare system from a physician's perspective to make this product or this service better for patients, right? That's actually a lot bigger than I ever imagined, and then, people have like, biotech and pharma and that sort of thing as well. But so medical consulting was number one at 25%. And then expert witness, what you're talking about, is a close second at 18%. Moonlighting, which I guess I could consider as locums, right? And then chart reviews. Those are, so chart reviews, expert witness, if you toss those together, it's over 30% of people that had one related to their medical field. But that was different than the non-medical stuff, the stuff not related to your medical degree. And there it was real estate, right? Not surprising. I mean, there's been a big push in the last 5 to 7 years, people that you and I know in this space that have, really, really kind of educated people and pushed for, let's just say, investments in real estate, from the syndication, more passive side to actively owning properties, all sorts of opinions on that. But, it is something that doctors are really getting into. And so those were the, most popular ones that were listed on here.
Yeah. Obviously, the lowest barrier to entry are something like locums, where you can just, and actually, you said something, and I wanted to bring this up, because this is going to be released probably in contract season for residents and fellows who are looking to transition to attendinghood. If you're going to have a side gig, make sure your employment agreement allows for it. So as you're looking at these contracts and looking at the language in them, if you have that clause in there that says, I hereby solemnly swear that anything I do, anything produced by my brain for as long as I work for this employer is going to belong to my employer, you need to protect your own intellectual property. You need to protect your own time. And that starts with the employment agreement. So make sure that if you're interested in the side gig, you don't sign something that precludes you from doing it legally, because it's pretty annoying if you're trying to work locums, or you finally get your employer to agree to take you down to 0.7 so you can do 1 week a year somewhere else, or 1 week a month somewhere else, and make a better wage per hour. And then come to find out, dang, they're going to take half, or they're going to like come after me legally if I do that. I've seen all kinds of onerous, challenging languages around this idea. And as an individual physician advocate, which is kind of where I fall in this ecosystem, it's very important for doctors to look at your contract and understand what it says about side gigs and whether or not you can even have one. And don't sign. My opinion is, unless you're totally like you need to be in one geographic locale and there's only one game in town and there's only one contract and their legal department is not going to budge, unless that's you, just don't sign something where you give away everything else that you do outside of your employment. That's like indentured servitude. Yep. That's not employment. And I categorically reject that.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And in fact, where I work, there's not only a conflict of interest policy, but as you're alluding to, there's a conflict of commitment policy, which basically says that anything that would take your attention away from the work that you're doing at the hospital is not okay. But they have a little bit of a workaround where you get permission, and the person I have to get permission from is actually my departmental chair. And so as long as I've always been able to negotiate that with whoever that may be, I've been able to do what I've done. And again, I think that if you're going to go this route, having those options available, super important, right? In your contract, similar to, restrictive covenants or non-competes, like you really need to think hard before you sign a contract with that in there. And there's conversations about the FTC getting rid of that, although that hasn't been, put in place yet. I think they may still be in the point of taking comments right now, actually. I'm not sure. I haven't checked on it in a few months. But if you're going to have a side gig, I think that, like anything in life, right, as a coach, you have to define your purpose. What is your why, right? So if it is like, I want to cut back to 0.9 FTE, you make $300,000 a year. Well, guess what? Whatever you're doing non-clinically has to make 30 grand for you to financially stay whole. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with saving less or spending less if you're going to get to your goals still. And so maybe you cut back your spending by $30,000, right? It doesn't have to be a side gig. You just have to do the math and figure it out. But I think it's important to have a goal to work toward. Otherwise, you're just kind of walking aimlessly and hoping to get somewhere that you don't know what it'll even look like when you get there. So that was highly important to me.
Absolutely. And unless you know where you're going and what the ideal looks like, you don't even have any clue what to push on or what needs to move or change in order to get there. And this is being released in January. I love January. I love New Year's. It's actually my favorite, I think, holiday, which is kind of weird. I love the opportunity for reflection. Yeah. The opportunity for reflection.
I'm going to make fun of you on a later episode
That's
about
great.
this.
I will own it. I will own it. And it may depend on the day or the week how I'm feeling. But I regularly come back to it. New Year's is such a unique opportunity to say, where am I? Where am I going? How do I feel about it? Have those conversations with your loved ones, with your spouse, if you're married, about taking stock. It's just built into the calendar every year, and I love thinking critically about how do I make sure that I'm living with intention. And I just love that it's like the merry-go-round every year. It just comes back around, and here we are, and let's think about it and talk about it and go forth with a purpose. And
I think it's interesting. Yeah, because I mean, there's classic stories, right? As people listen to this in January, like, oh yeah, I'm finally going to get fit again, and 4 weeks later, their gym membership has not been used. And so, do you remember, like, what were your New Year's resolutions for 2020?
Dude.
We're recording this now in December, so 12 months later, do you actually remember them? Do you have them written down? Do you have them written down?
Let me hold on. Let me see.
He's running away from the camera and the microphone to find it.
I've got a bunch of these like old. Let me see if I can find one of these because there have been times where I would like on New Year's Eve sit down and just like make a long. This is the young and ambitious version of me. It was like, I'm 28 years old. I'm gonna have 28 New Year's resolutions, and I'm just gonna sling it all against the wall. And if I only get 7 of them, then that's a win.
One for each year. Well, while you're looking into that, I found it interesting because it's kind of a related point in this study. But 72% of docs that had a side gig basically said they earned less than they wanted to, despite spending 20 hours a week. Or a month, on their. So like this reminds me, like the New Year's resolution, like I'm going to lose weight, and then 4 weeks later you're not using gym membership, or I'm going to save more money, and then somehow you're spending more money. Like I would love to know what the numbers are in terms of correlation between the goals people set and what percentage of people actually meet them.
Yeah, and part of me, the fun of it is not. I mean, obviously you want to improve, and the goal is to have some positive change, but even the act of the reflecting and the act of the dreaming, the act of the thinking, is part of what makes it fun, and thinking about what could be, and sort of I am an idealist by nature, even though like healthcare is depressing. I don't think like it's not worth trying to fix.
This is going to work really well because you're an idealist and I am a realist with pessimistic leanings.
Yeah, well, I think I am definitely I guess I'm probably more like a realist with optimistic leanings. It's a better way to describe
the
it.
other direction.
And I'm totally pragmatic. So like what do we actually functionally, tactically do right now today to move the needle in the direction we want to move it? I can't readily find anything in these I know they're somewhere.
Your notebooks. No,
historical resolution.
I find it interesting. But I do think as people are making their goals for this year, I think personally this is one to consider. And the reason why is because the number of doctors that I've coached, I've gotten to know personally that want to create some financial autonomy in their life outside of medicine. Locums is a way to do it, particularly right now because you're making more per hour doing locums than you are working in an employed position. So like you mentioned, I think that's a great opportunity. If you want to do medical malpractice work, that's obviously something you can do on your own time. Chart reviews, similar. Advising or consulting, similar. You just have to figure out what's the number I need to get to move the needle, and what am I trying to solve? If it's time away from the hospital, clearly you don't want to pick up another side gig that prevents you from being home, right? So I think this is one to chalk on there. Just consider it. Do you want to be one of the 50% of doctors that are considering or performing a side gig or not? I think it's a conversation worth having.
And a lot of these, even like something like locums, you could argue locums is like one of the easiest things. Probably medical legal is the easiest, but locums would be sort of the second easiest in terms of accessibility to this audience. But if you decide in January, okay, I want to do locums, like it's probably going to take you until September before you're working a locums shift, because you got to figure out where you want to go, figure out am I licensed in that state, maybe work with an agency, wait for all the, credentialing and paperwork and pushing stuff back and forth. And, oh, we're missing that document. And please find your transcript from 8th grade to make sure that you pass middle school, all that stuff. And it just takes that long. And then you're going to have to give notice in January that with my employer 9 months from now, I want to be half time so that I can, work 1 week a month locums. And it just takes time to turn that aircraft carrier. So if you think you might even be interested in 2024, like, got to start today to begin that process, because it does take a while to get there.
Yeah, totally. And, I've actually got a friend at work that's going through this situation right now, has a non-compete, restrictive covenant, and is doing locums for the time period that non-compete is in place. And so has used that as a way of getting around that to come back and practice in the area after that's done. So definitely think it's a worthwhile consideration. And, if you are considering a side gig, hopefully the show kind of gave you some realistic ideas in terms of, lots of doctors are doing it. A lot of doctors are not making as much money as they'd like from doing it. Justin, many of your clients, it's not even ending up on their tax return. So this isn't to say that you shouldn't do side gigs, but you should be very clear about what you're doing, the needle you're moving, what your purpose is, and how you are going to get there. But before we end the show, don't forget, you can head on over to moneymeetsmedicine.com, snag actually a free copy of the Physician Philosopher's Guide to Finance, my book, if you want. But you can also get on occupation disability insurance quotes from somebody you can actually trust. So if that's what you're looking for, particularly as January is coming around, that might be a resolution as well to make sure you're tacking off your asset protection, then by all means, go over to moneymeetsmedicine.com. Justin, I'll see you in a little bit. Cheers.
Can't wait.